We are recording. Edmundo, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I appreciate your support. And for folks, just to know that Dawn has been so instrumental in setting up this entire series. So mad appreciation and thanks for all of the legwork and logistical work that Dawn has done, as well as just being a thought partner through this whole process. So what I would like to do now is just to go introduce our panelists formally, and then we'll ask them to do a little bit of conocimiento, a little bit of sharing about themselves, so that we know where they are coming from as they share their stories. So let's see, let me go here, and if I could, well, let me start off with Chesa Caparaz, who uses she, they pronouns, as a faculty in English and Asian American Studies and at De Anza. And she is, in English and Asian American and Asian Studies at De Anza. And she is a faculty coordinator of the Jean Miller Resource Room for Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and is an active member of the Asian Pacific American Staff Association, and just an awesome colleague to have in doing this work. So Chesa, actually, so let us do this. So Chesa, would you be willing to just jump in now and give us your
yeah story? Oh, my story, or the ethnic studies piece?
Ooh, good point. Ethnic studies, please. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me, Edmundo. And he also asked me to give a brief overview of Asian American Studies or ethnic studies. And it's like, well, how do you do that in 3 minutes? I'm like, oh, I don't know. But part of, I think, the spirit of this panel is speaking from the I. And so, what I would like to start out with is, just pointing out that, like all racial and ethnic identities, like Asian American identity is not monolithic. We're not all one, shared, we don't all have shared cultural experiences. And so for that reason, just as someone who is on this panel, like, I'm not pretending or assuming that I speak for the entire Asian American community. And I think that is part of the philosophy and the feeling behind Asian American Studies, is that how do we tell our own stories? How do we see our individual, our culturally unique perspectives reflected in the curriculum, in our faculty, in our leaders? And so for those who don't know that much about the history of ethnic studies, it began in the United States in the 1960s with Third World Liberation Front in San Francisco State, and also at UC Berkeley, and there were other movements in UCLA. A lot of really amazing folks have already written on this, so I'm not going to go too much into that history. But again, like, some of the major trends that I want to highlight are what I hinted at before, which is disaggregation, right? How do we disaggregate our community? Because I think as beneficial as it has been to have this sort of Pan-Asian identity and solidarity, there's a lot of stories and experiences that get lost when we're all seen as just like one, like, Asian American entity. And so, really wanting to highlight that even the acronym like AAPI, like, you'll notice that this particular event is an Asian American, panel. And I think that's part of that disaggregation, to recognize that, the Pacific Islander experience is also very distinct from the Asian American experience. And so I believe next week you're going to be hearing from folks in the Native American and Indigenous Studies department who can speak more about the Pacific Islander experience. The other thing that I really want to highlight is the importance of student activism in the movement. If students weren't demanding these classes, if they weren't demanding this representation, like, a lot of this work wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have ethnic studies today. And so I think it's this feedback loop between hearing the stories of the individuals and then advocating for, like, oh my gosh, that meant so much to me to hear that story. I want to hear more of that, and I want it to be, I don't want it to be like an addendum or one chapter in a history book. I want an entire class built around it. So even here at De Anza, there has been student advocacy for classes that represent the different communities. The Filipinx American History and Culture class that I taught last quarter is part of that movement of students advocating for themselves and for their stories. So don't, if you know, like, one thing about the history of ethnic studies, don't forget that it is really student driven and student led, and that is a lot of the power. And then the last thing that I want to say, which I think that this series of events really speaks to, is that it has also been like a multiracial, multi-ethnic, like movement, right? For this solidarity across different cultures and across different races, you know, from the Filipino Manons, like, you know, working with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, to the current Asian Americans in solidarity with Black Lives, to just this panel that you're, you know, have been witnessing so far. Like, I think that's a really important piece to remember, that, you know, when we all work together to fight these systemic oppressions and inequalities, then a lot of really beautiful things can come out of it. I hope that was 3 minutes or less. But
Thank you. Beautiful. I super appreciate that. You said it is a major challenge to be able to condense that. So thank you. Beautiful job, Chesa. So with that overview now, I'd like to introduce our remaining 2 panelists. And I'm going to go first with, let's see, Kimberly, are you available to? I just want to introduce you first. And well, let me just go ahead and say. So Kimberly Lam is currently in her second year at De Anza, studying political science and hoping to major in Asian American studies and music. Kimberly has been involved with Poly Youth Leadership Academy firstly as a student and later as a mentor and intern, and now works to advocate for equity issues, including racial justice, as the De Anza Student Government Chair of Student Rights and Services. So Kimberly will be one of our panelists. And then also on our panel, super grateful to also have here back with us on our campus, Tom Izzo. Tom Izzo is the immediate past executive director of California History Center, the CHC at De Anza College. He retired in 2019 after 25 years of service to the college, and he continues to act as an advisor to the California History Center. Currently, Tom co-directs the Hidden Histories of San Jose Japantown project for the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. This project explores the overlapping histories of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos in Japantown neighborhood using augmented reality art. You know, Tom is also the co-founder of the San Jose Nikkei Resistors, which is a grassroots activist organization. You know, Tom just brings a wealth of history and life experiences, and we're grateful that Tom was able to join us for today. So now we're shifting to our main event, our community conversation fishbowl within that is focusing on the Asian American community. And what we want to start with, again, a principle that I learned way back from community organizing is the conocimiento principle. It's this idea of knowing each other, not just our titles and our roles, but having a deeper understanding of who we are as the individuals, of what our life stories are that we bring to the work that we do. So we want to make sure that we take some time, and we're asking each panelist to tell us, again, in brief, you know, in just 2 or 3 minutes, you know, what has been the history, what has been the creation story, if you will, of their own social justice consciousness. You know, what it is throughout their whole lives, what are the things that have contributed to that and that may continue to contribute to that. So Chesa, are you willing to start us off with that? Uh-oh.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, so thanks again. So my sort of social justice creation story, or just like my history, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm Filipina American, Pinay. I've used many different like labels. And one of the biggest formative experiences for me was I actually, growing up in D.C., I'm kind of around a lot of diplomats and like international organizations. And so my family actually had the opportunity to send me to boarding school in Switzerland. So I went to boarding school in Switzerland, and it was a privilege, but we were subsidized. So we definitely, you know, weren't the privileged folks at that school. And so even though the school was racially and ethnically diverse, in terms of class, socioeconomic class, it was not very diverse. It was a lot of really rich students who would go to this boarding school because they wanted like a sort of American educational experience, but located in Switzerland. So it was interesting for me to be solidly middle class in the US and then to go to Swiss boarding school and just feel like working class, you know, like I had classmates who were spending like $1,000 a week. And I was like, you're 14, like, how could you spend that? Anyway, I mean, no judgment, but like, that's, you know, that was just some of the experience. And then after, after boarding school, I came back and it was just complete culture shock. And then I went to UC Santa Barbara, which was another complete culture shock because for folks who don't know it, I mean, it has associations as a party school. There's a very active Greek life, and it just didn't jive well with who I was at the time, and I felt very alienated. And so I actually dropped out of college and went to community college, which was another sort of formative experience. It's another reason why I'm so committed to teaching at community college, because I think it really saved my educational goals to be able to go there. And then when I went to UC Santa Cruz, that's when I started to get the language of becoming politicized. You know, I was taking like intro to Marxist theory and like working with, you know, all these different research clusters and community like organizations. And I was also pregnant at the time. And so being an undergraduate with a child, I was just like, wow, there's a lot of like injustices for folks who don't fit the sort of typical student model. So that's when I started both learning how to work in the community and starting to decolonize a little bit of my own educational history. And what's really hard, and I'll talk about this later with some of the other questions, but for me, like decolonization has been a really fraught sort of journey, because in a lot of ways, like you're challenging the culture that you were raised in. You know, you're challenging, like my parents passed down their colonial mentality. And so the process of decolonizing is a process of challenging what my parents and my family taught me. And so it's, you know, as much as I'm trying to also get them to decolonize, it also feels like this very American thing to do, to be like, hey, like, you know, mom and dad, why didn't you ever fight back against people who forced you to speak English? You know, so it's just very complicated. And so it's a journey that I'm, you know, I think we're all on in different ways, but I just wanted to highlight that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chesa. I appreciate that. And actually, you know what, now I'm just going according to my screen, and I have this practice of I just go to the left around the circle. And so Kimberly, you happen to be to Chesa's left on my screen.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Lam, pronouns she, her, hers. I guess I'll start with my parents because they are my story as well. So my parents are Vietnamese Americans. They immigrated from the Vietnam War about 7 years before I was born. I was born and raised in Eastside San Jose, and we were not at all like well off. We really struggled. We've always been low income, and so I grew up really internalizing a lot of hatred for myself and my family as a result of that. I grew up really fast. I had to help with paperwork. I had to help with signing up for like Section 8 housing. And so yeah, it was really difficult growing up. And I remember like just hating myself a lot, and I'm getting emotional, I'm sorry. And yeah, it wasn't until much later in high school that I began to think like, why do I hate myself? Sorry. And I started learning about colonialism. I started learning about capitalism. I started learning about Orientalism. And this really opened up my mind as to like what I wanted to advocate for. And so yeah, I ended up being able to make it into really great universities in high school, but we weren't able to afford any of them. So I went to community college. And at first I was like devastated because I think you really internalize the stigma of going to community college, but this is one of the best decisions I have ever made. And I've really found such a family and community at De Anza. Yeah, I took my first ethnic studies classes here. I took my first Asian American studies classes here. And since then, I've just been trying to advocate as much as possible for low-income students, for basic needs, for racial justice, for affordable housing, anything that I can on campus. I'm hoping to work in the future in this field as well to utilize my privilege in any way that I can to help others. So yeah, that's my story. And I'm an emotional person, so I'm likely going to be crying throughout this entire panel. Just giving you all a heads up.
Thank you for that, Kimberly. And I know we're accustomed in this dominant culture to think that the expression of emotions is something that is not okay, and we apologize for it, and that's kind of a habit that's in us. But we absolutely welcome it. And I forgot to mention up front that it would be useful for folks to have a handkerchief or a box of tissue handy. Because this is what humanizes us to each other, to hear the real stories and the impacts that that has. So super appreciate you, Kimberly, for setting the tone for us. Take a deep breath after that. And I look to my screen, and to your left is Tom Izu. So I'm gonna invite Tom now.
Hello, everyone. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a third generation Japanese American. And I'm gonna read something because otherwise I either forget what I'm going to say or just start rambling. So forgive me for that. My grandparents emigrated from Japan to the US in the early 1900s to work the fields and orchards of California. Both my parents were born in the US, father in Los Altos, mother in San Jose. Both sides of my family faced the virulent anti-Japanese movement organized by US white supremacists in the 1920s. And when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and pushed the US into World War II, they were forcibly removed from California and, along with all other Japanese Americans, sent to prison camps or exile. My father and his extended family moved out of the West Coast war zone to Utah and did migrant labor there until being drafted into the US Army and sent to fight in Italy. My mother and her family ended up in Poston concentration camp in Arizona, where she spent her entire high school career. They later met at San Jose State after the war and started a family. I was born in Seattle, Washington, where my father found a job years later, but we moved back to California when I was 3 years old, so my father could take care of his aging mother. My parents never talked about what happened to them during the war, but dropped strange clues about camp days, especially when talking with other Japanese Americans. I went to schools nearby De Anza College. They were overwhelmingly white back then. I perceived my experience to be very hostile and an alienating one. People constantly made fun of everything about me, from what I ate, the sound of my last name, and how I looked. Jap, Gook, Chink became my new name. Even though I was born after the camps happened, the wartime experience of my parents reached into my life. Feelings of shame and a quiet desperation drove me to struggle to fit in somehow, even if it seemed hopeless. When I went to college in the mid-1970s, I followed the advice of my two older brothers and joined the student movement in the fight for ethnic studies. I learned about being Asian American. This was a new term to me. Asian American, not a Jap or Gook or Chink, but part of a group with a place in this country that I wished desperately to join. The student movement also taught me the importance of solidarity between what they called back then the Black, Chicano, Native, Asian American student groups, and also the need to go back to our communities to serve our people, because no one else was going to do this unless we stepped in to do it ourselves. After college, I went to live and work in San Jose, Japantown, where my grandparents still lived, and I ran a senior center for Japanese American elderly. I also became involved in the grassroots fight for redress for the World War II incarceration of my community. Through this movement in particular, I learned more about what had happened back then, about the systemic nature of racism and how my entire community had been rendered politically dysfunctional by the US government, divided into factions, whipped into silence, and then in the post-war period, forced to assimilate and turn into a, quote, loyal model minority, unquote, to be used as a wedge against the growing Black Power movement and to keep us from defending Chinese Americans and others during the early Cold War years. I felt that my community needed to be freed from this spell, and the movement for redress became a way to do this, to get Japanese Americans to remember, speak out, mend the damage between our community's generations, and demand justice for ourselves, so we would be able to join with all other communities then fighting for equality. Based on this experience and what it taught me, I also became involved in solidarity work with local Mexicano and Chicano organizations fighting against profiling, deportation, and for workers' rights, and active in the Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition. All of this shaped my social justice lens as I went on to do other things, including working at De Anza College. And more recently, in co-founding San Jose Nikkei Resistors, a multi-generational Japanese American activist group that does grassroots organizing to build support in our community right now for reparations for slavery, against anti-Asian violence, and for reimagining public safety. So thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Tom. I just super appreciate how you weaving in your story with what has been happening, with the history of what has happened in so much of the throughout this country. So taking that in, and then moving now to your left is our fourth panelist, Marlo. Marlo, love to hear from you.
Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here. My name is Marlo Alvarado Custodio. I'm named after my mom. She was hoping for a daughter, and instead I was a boy. And so she named me Marlo as her junior. Her name is Mary Lou. And so really, I'm just living out her story. I'm the third out of 4 sons. Knowing that I was her junior, I always knew I was going to be a mama's boy, and I was going to do whatever it took in life to make her proud, to protect her, and of course, like many children of immigrants, be her translator. Unfortunately, my father was overcome through addiction, drugs, gambling, and domestic violence was a common tale in our household. I was only 2 years old when my father used to viciously beat me. And I just remember being 2 and 3 and my older brothers being separated from me to foster care. And that really affected my family. When my father left, it really intensified my values for responsibility, service, and fairness. And being homeless taught us a lot of lessons. But I think the greatest part about it was that we had each other, and we no longer had to worry about being hurt or living in fear from someone that was supposed to love us. And that really traumatized me growing up. It caused a lot of turbulence in my youth, caused a lot of turbulence with my brothers, and living around a low income neighborhood. I grew up in Eastside San Jose, Aborn and King. At the time, my associations were around other gang members, Asian gang members, drug dealers, drug addicts, in which, unbeknownst to me later on in life, I realized that they were children that were also overcoming traumas in their households, households of refugee households, households of parents dealing with suicidal tendencies. And that really affected the way I behaved and responded to school. Instead of seeing someone that was working with challenges within, my teachers saw me as a knucklehead, as a troublemaker. And unfortunately, that's how I was labeled throughout my public education career. It wasn't until I connected with a mentor at the Filipino Youth Coalition based in Eastside San Jose, Welsh Park, where I met a social worker who took me under his arms, took me in his wings, and just kind of took me to events. And one of the events that he actually took me was at De Anza, and it was a youth empowerment festival. Sorry. I told myself I was gonna get emotional. I was 16 at the time, and I was so used to having people telling me that I wouldn't succeed, and also the kind of internal trauma that we had to deal with my brothers and the neighborhoods that we were constantly in war with. And it was just so refreshing to have people from De Anza, from the professors to the mentors to the students, encouraging me that I could be something more. And that was my first entry to wanting to pursue higher education. It was this festival and later empowerment festival that would later on be called Youth Voices United for Change, emphasis on social justice. And unbeknownst to me, later on, I'd be working at the Institute of Community and Civic Engagement at De Anza, which is now known as VITA. And I spent 4 lovely years of my time in my community college career, working for social justice and advocating for students to pursue a higher education. At age 16, I attended the Asian Pacific American Leadership Institute. And at that time, it was a very painful summer. There was a lot going on in San Jose at that time for me and my circles. That was the year that a good friend of mine, she was murdered. And during that time for me, my escape was at De Anza. I spent my summer at Sunnyvale with family, and I would take the bus to De Anza, and I was away from the East Side for that nice summer. And in that summer, that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I was learning about Asian American history. And I knew at that moment that even though it seemed like I wasn't going to successfully like pass SATs or even like barely pass high school, I just knew, I was like, at least I'm going to go to De Anza. And that was going to be my refresher. That was going to be like my new beginning. And that on February 5th, I happened to be at the wrong place, wrong time. And my family and I were beat up by San Jose police officers. And it became a highly publicized case. There was a misunderstanding, and we all, I was beat and tased. My mom was slammed against the car, arrested, and my brother was beat by 5 cops and tased by 3 tasers for more than a minute. And in an effort to protect themselves, they placed these fabricated police reports and charged us as criminals. As a senior in high school, I spent some time in county jail, just kind of reflecting, how did this come to this? And was this all just the karma of just growing up turbulent as a young man? And I just remember community really came out. I remember De Anza college professors packing the courtrooms whenever I had court cases. And I just always thought like, man, there's so much love and people that understand my community and our Southeast Asian communities and the experiences that we have, that really impacted me. And I carried, I stayed focused and determined to finish my higher education. Whenever I slipped and couldn't continue because of court cases and stress and fighting a highly publicized case, my mentors at De Anza kept me in line and kept me focused. And I knew it wasn't going to take me 2 years. I just knew that no matter what, as long as I could get it done, I could get it done. I eventually transferred to UC Santa Cruz. And after my time in Santa Cruz, I knew I could be a good student. That was my first time I actually focused on being a student. I always had a low GPA, but being able to actually be a student and not worry about anything else after my case subsided, I was able to grow up. I was able to graduate magna cum laude, and I just knew I had it in me. I just needed support, and that was really important for me in my development. That passion, I carried it on in my work in filmmaking. I launched 5 communities at 5 community centers. I led a digital storytelling program with the San Jose Parks and Recreation Services. We won an international award for a music video we did for a student in West Side San Jose, and that would later on lead me to more funding to expand my programs and then teach incarcerated youth and juvenile hall. After my time with the city of San Jose, I started doing consulting work for nonprofits, and I launched my own advertising agency called NEBA, focus on empathy because of my mentor Mundo from when I was a community college student, cinema with an empathic lens. And I had the pleasure of working with the Knight Foundation, Hispanics in Philanthropy, and an initiative called Ascend BLO, focus on supporting 200 Black-led organizations in the Bay Area. I continue my work working with Fortune 500 companies, and I just got tired of the rhythm of doing corporate work. I wanted to do more work in that was going to bring me back to something more impactful. And so an opportunity popped up for a multimedia producer role at De Anza, and I was like, there it is. Yes. And it brought me back to my community, and that's kind of been my lens. De Anza has influenced my social justice lens personally, and as well as institutionally. And and growing up without a father and dealing with the injustices of living low income really changes and shapes the way I am now as a father. I have a beautiful 2-year-old son, and it just feels so good to be back at De Anza. Random fact, my son is actually named after a Bible story that Michelle Blueburns shared with me when I was going through some hard times at De Anza. My son's first name is Nehemiah. And so, yeah, now, I've been living in my mom's story, and now I'm just living in my son's story. And I'm very happy to be back at De Anza to continue the work that my mentors have done for me.
Thank you, Marlo. Wow. Yeah. And always sending good vibes, health and healing vibes for your mom. And yeah, that. So I just want to name this piece of, again, this ethnic studies comes out of grassroots organizing work. And part of grassroots organizing work is this principle that we hear each other's stories. We draw from our indigenous traditions and wisdoms, because all of us go back far enough, we have, we come from indigenous communities. And this is important. This is essential to doing the work going forward, that we know more about each other. So thank you all for bravely, authentically, sharing your stories and where you come from, and we'll see how those weave in as we now shift to the 6 questions that we're hoping to get through with every panel. And I just want to give folks a heads up. We will take a bio break somewhere around 3:40. We're going to go with the flow. We're going to get through as much dialogue in responding to some core questions that you'll see in the chat in a bit. So there will be a designated time. We'll take up a 5-minute bio break, but of course, attend to the physical domain of your needs as you need to. So. So the first question that we've asked all the panelists is to respond to in some way, and in this case, we have certain folks are going to take the lead in answering particular questions, and then we'll just take it from there and see how that flows. Let's see. So I think Marlo, you were up actually for our very first question. And the question is, how has systemic structural racism impacted your community, both historically and in the present? What do you want us to know about what it looks like, and like what both blatant and subtle forms it takes? And in particular, how is it that this structural systemic racism impacts you in your body, in your heart, and in your spirit?
Thank you, Mano. I think when thinking about systemic and structural racism towards Asian Americans, there's events that come to mind that really affect the emotional and mental for me, and the perception of Asian Americans, and I think greatly is the effect of not being seen as American and not being American enough. The war of imperialism that was the war of imperialism, where the Philippines, it's known as the Spanish-American War, but to us, that was the Filipino Revolution. That was the Philippine Revolution. After Spanish's 333 years of colonization, America, who was an ally, did a backdoor deal of buying some, I think it was Guam and Philippines, and I think may have been Puerto Rico too. Sorry if I'm forgetting here, but in 1898, the Philippine Revolution, America came in and it was genocide, murdering 200,000 Filipinos in the late 1800s. Actually, the Colt 45 is something that is remembered for those in history of this particular time in Filipino history, because it was the weapon that was created to take down Filipinos. I think of the Chinese Exclusion Act, where immigrants from China came to America and played a role in developing the railroads in for the U.S. Major cities to become leading in the economy. I think of Tom's story about the what Japanese Americans experience, not being seen as Americans, and the distrust that was seen upon our community, and unfortunately Japanese Americans being put into internment camps. I think about the Hanapepe massacre of Filipino migrant workers who came to Hawaii and working in the sugar plantations, and constantly targeted by white labor and the police force. Think about not too far from here, the Watsonville riots. Filipino farm workers in Stockton and Watsonville being told that they can't be at certain restaurants, or they can't date out of their race, and leading to murders and race riots. There has been a systemic depiction of Asian Americans in history and in cinema. If one is to think that there isn't a correlation of this in Hollywood, there's actually case studies that reveal how government intervention was key into Hollywood cinema in order to create hate towards Japanese during World War II. There continues the person that made Birth of a Nation, the filmmaker that made Birth of a Nation, that later on would lead to the Ku Klux Klan. The motivation of the Ku Klux Klan being created was also the filmmaker for Chink and the Child. And this organization would later on, the founder of that of the United Artists would later on be one of the organizers for the Oscars. So there's been a systemic and structural racism with the exploitation of our labor, and unfortunately not being recognized and acknowledged for the accomplishments and the achievements that we have had into making America a superpower, as many other communities have had played a role in. I'm kind of rambling here.
Marlo, that's
Yeah.
You specifically asked me to give you the time checks, and so
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was so who would like to chime in on that first question along with Marlo?
I can chime in as well, but I definitely want to not take up too much time and let other folks speak too, because a couple things, in terms of systemic institutionalized forms of racism and how it affects me. I mean, there's the myth of the perpetual foreigner, right? That we're never really part of this country. But, like the United States, they invaded the Philippines, you know what I mean? So we've been, quote unquote, American since 1898. Right, but we're never seen as American, and then there's also the model minority myth, right, where it's like, everyone assumes that you're good at math, or that you're going to be a doctor and engineer. I'm very fortunate that my family did not put that pressure on me, but it's definitely, like as Marlo was talking about, something you see in film, right? The Asians are usually represented as the nerdy types. And when we talk about Asians, we also usually think about East Asians, right? We're not talking, a lot of folks, don't associate like Southeast Asians or South Asians, with that representation. And so I think that's also one of the ways that it's hurt us. And to not take up too much time, I guess I just want to ask folks in the audience, like, how would it affect your body, your spirit, and your mind to be invisible? To feel invisible, to feel not seen, to feel like you just look like everybody else, right? I've definitely had, on campus, like folks call me by the name of, another Asian in my division or whatever. It's like, there's this confusion, this like illusion that, we're all the same. And then to even talk more intersectionally about it, right? For Asian women, like, how would it affect, imagine how it affects your body, your spirit, your heart, to be a fetish object, right? And how does that impact the ways that you think about desire, about, your own relationships, the own ways that you are valued in this country? So just like, things to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Kimberly.
Yeah, I think Chessa brought up a really great point, which is intersectionality. And I just want to add on a little bit to that. I think it's a problem with being invisible and seen as a perpetual foreigner, but then also being utilized and spun into narratives that are self-serving, you know, especially for the like white supremacy view. And so it's viewing Asian women as objects, as property of white men. And every time I bring this up to anyone when I'm having a conversation, they say that that's not a 2021 perspective. But I was just on TikTok last night and I was like following one of my favorite Asian American women who speaks about politics. And under her comments, because she's talking about fetishization as well, there are multiple men in those comments saying that Asian women are the object of white men. Like that is a genuine view that people have now. And that is so incredibly toxic. And then for our Asian men, they emasculate them. They say that as much as Asian women are sexualized, Asian men are unattractive. Asian men are not real men, or Asian men are demonized, you know, in American media, especially early on. And so it makes me fear to share my femininity with the world. It makes me fear for my mom, who is a working class woman exposed to the world. And so it's about these attitudes and the ways that they impact us. And I could go on and talk about like how the model minority impacts me as well as a low income woman of color. But the ways that we are minimized, we are used as objects, it's dangerous and it needs to stop. So I think that I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. Thank you, Kimberly. I mean, if anybody else want to chime on, speak to that question before we go to the next question?
Yes, and I just want to put a big plug in for ethnic studies, because if it wasn't for ethnic studies, I would have never learned any of this stuff. I mean, I think like Chessa mentioned, when I went to college, I started learning about the things that were considered to be radical, about political economy and understanding the structural nature of capitalism and all that. But to connect it to the racism that we're talking about, it just wasn't there, except for when ethnic studies started. And without ethnic studies, I think people like ourselves, what we're left with when we start seeing these contradictions, either we're left with the idea there's something wrong with us because we see these things and we can't explain it. And other people just say, nah, it's not really happening. You're just too sensitive. Or we go crazy, you know. I mean, that's kind of what I felt, that it's so important to understand the structural part to this racism. And then you start all these things start making more sense and you realize you're not crazy. This whole system is really crazy. So I just want to put a big plug in for ethnic studies, because that's really one of the most important things in my life. It's helped me.
Major snaps. Thank you so much, Tom. I mean, that what you're naming there is just such a resonant theme for so many of us, so many, Black, Indigenous, people of color, this is the second question that we're shifting into now. Unlike, in the way that other courses are taught, if there's, you've got your syllabus, you've got your course outline of record, you've got your content that you're going to cover, your student learning outcomes. Part of the pedagogy of ethnic studies is about hearing people's stories. And it is about having that impact. It is an empowering experience in terms of, offering an actually more realistic frame for what has happened in our lives, so that the judgments, the external judgments of shame and blame pointed inwardly, that we take in, it gives us an alternative view. So I just thank you so much, Tom, for explicitly, naming that piece. And then Kimberly, you were actually on to our second question there. Like, what does internalized racism look like in your community? And how does this impact your body, your heart, your spirit? Both at the worst, most extreme, blatant times and just in everyday life.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I guess I'll start with my body. And I'll start from my perspective and then I'll go outwards. For me, I grew up very, very tan. When I was younger, I loved swimming. I loved going out in the sun. But there is extreme colorism within the Asian American community, within the Asian community as well, which is also fueled by racism, and this adherence to the white supremacy system, right? That white people are at the very top, the most attractive, the most ideal. And so I remember like at a young age, at 7 years old, I would like cry in my bathtub trying to scrub the brown out of my skin. And I think that it breaks my heart to think of other young children doing that. Yeah, because Vietnamese people are not naturally just pale. We also tan. I think of like my country people bleaching their skin, getting skin cancer for these beauty standards, right? I think of my mom saying I should get a nose job because it will do me better in my career aspects. I think of the ways that we are told that Asian features are unattractive, right? And then they are utilized in media, they are appropriated, and it suddenly looks amazing on white women or white people. So that's body, like self-image, the way that I perceive myself. I'm working for that now. I'm trying to love my Asian features. I'm trying to love the way that I feel in my body and beyond. I'm trying to, again, work on my expressing my femininity without fearing being fetishized, and trying to just own myself and my love for myself and my culture. I think in regards to my heart, my internalized racism was a lot to do with my economic status as well, and it was a lot to do with the model minority status, right? The model minority stereotype. I'm sorry, the idea that all Asian Americans are rich and are smart and can get themselves out of poverty. And that's negative in so many ways, because it not only puts down other minorities and people of color by saying you're just lazy, you're not doing enough, but it also hurts the Asian American communities that are not well off, specifically Southeast Asians, specifically Filipinx and others. For my family, we came to America with nothing really, and my parents were always so guilty that they always felt like it was their fault for not being able to be successful, to buy a house. And I shared that guilt growing up. I was always so mad at myself that I wasn't able to work harder, to get money faster, to support my family. And I think we have to look past that, right? Because it's this system, this capitalistic system, that sees us as labor. And it's also this idea that Asians somehow are rich. And so I really internalized that, and I'm still working through it. I guess on a larger level, I would say that the Asian American community is really impacted by both the perpetual foreigner and model minority myth. The idea that we're invisible. An example is like growing up reading books, I would picture myself as white. I never imagined myself as Asian in my stories. In my head, I had blonde hair, I had green eyes. I never had my features when I was reading stories, because I never saw myself in movies, in television, in books. And so I internalized the perpetual foreigner stereotype, and I mentioned the model minority as well. I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, but
Yeah.
it's extremely dangerous, and I think I am still working against my internalized racism and trying to help my family unpack that as well, to accept that their Asian features and my Asian features are beautiful, and even if it doesn't match the current beauty standard, we still are valid and accepted in our own bodies. That we have worked hard enough, and we deserve a seat at this table, and we deserve to be in America and to be seen. So yeah, that's
Thank you, Kimberly. There's so much in what you just named there. One thing that particularly strikes me and stands out is just, again, something that I've heard as a thematic across different communities of color, is like that initial, like that because of what we see in the media, what we read in the books, even our own stories, when we put ourselves in this character's roles, we're putting ourselves into that white image, and just just the impact that has internally on us. Thank you for that, Chessa.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that because I had the same experience. I remember as a kid being surprised when I looked in the mirror and being like, oh, I'm not white. Like the story, the way I was living out my life. And I had like predominantly white friends, even though when I was with my family, it was a big Filipino community. but in most of my school, most of my social spaces, I was hanging out with white folks, seeing them in the, on TV and reading stories about them. And so I remember my biggest dream was that my blonde haired, blue eyed Barbie doll would come to life and be my best friend, because that would feel like I had made it, that I was like now like accepted. And that is like some of the internalized racism. And what Kimberly was saying, I remember my family saying, sleep with a clothespin on your nose so it doesn't get flat, right? And there's internalized racism in that. It's also, within the Filipinx community, right, internalized against the indigenous Filipinos, right? Because it's usually the more indigenous Filipinos who are darker skinned, flatter noses. And then also, to complicate the body piece, like, okay, I'll admit I was a fat kid growing up. At least, by my family standards, right? They would always call me fat, and always comment on my weight, and that was really challenging, not just as a woman, but as a woman of color, because there are so many colonial standards that are implied in that, and also feeling like it didn't fit into the sort of Asian woman model of like petite and skinny, and you know what I mean? And so I had like tons of body image stuff growing up for not being white and not being skinny. And that has really, it's still, I'm still healing from it. So I'll just be real about that. And I think that in terms of like I know it's not part of the question, but in terms of my academic work, like there was a lot of internalized racism around that. Like I majored in French literature. Like I did not grow up studying the literature of my people. It wasn't until I was introduced to post-colonial theory to study French literature that I was like, oh, wow, there's like this whole school of thought around why people like me don't study the literature of my people. You know what I mean? So that I think was also definitely part of the internalized racism. I didn't think that the stories that my people told were worthy of study or were worthy of scholarship. And so now it's like, I feel like I'm having this like rekindling, like all I want to do is learn more. Like the experience that people are talking about when they took their first ethnic studies class is just like, I still remember when I thought, oh my gosh, like my people are worthy of knowing. And that was so validating.
Yeah. Oh, I realize that it's, we've only gotten through the two of the questions, but this has been just like so rich. We are just about at 3:40 now, so I'm wondering if in between these two questions, between the questions now, we take a. I want to check to the panelists because you're the ones that are on the screen. You want to take a bio break, do a 5-minute break right now, or you want to get through one more question?
Could I chime in on something?
Go for it.
I mentioned in my story where in the summer I spent time in Sunnyvale. I have a father figure. He's a white dude from Long Island. He's probably like one of the only white men I know that can cook sinigang and like Filipino food. But we look and reflect back at it with love. But growing up, I just remember I hated him. and the reason why is because when we used to go to stay out there in Sunnyvale every summer, I just saw he would just be so hard on us, right? And I just remember all my family showering my cousins with love because they were half white, half Filipino. And so already it felt like, damn, like we're already kind of seen as like the black sheep of the family, or we were seen as like the ones that were the knuckleheads. And then on top of that, we had to deal with every Christmas, every birthday, and constantly hear like the backhand comments towards us for not being light skinned. That really affected me. And I do want to say though, despite all that and seeing that and dealing with that as a kid, what really got me through this, and it's hella random, but it was Tupac. And he has this line from Keep Your Head Up. I think it was Keep Your Head Up, but as the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. I say the darker the flesh, then the deeper the roots. So that line would always hit me. And I just remember like whatever the fuck they want to feel and say towards me, like I'm proud of like my skin. I'm proud of my nose. And there was like this kind of like rebelliousness and just pride that I had. And and it, and it's, always to Tupac and just the culture that the music I was listening to, and yeah, just a random story to share and how that affected me personally.
Yeah, like, so I'm hearing there, Marlo, that even the themes that come up from other communities of color, that there's a resonance there. They're affirming in the way that they cut across, all these experiences that everyone is naming here. So thank you. Appreciate you naming that, Marlo. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll take a short bio break here, and we will start back again at, let's see, I guess that will be 3:47. We'll be back. Thank you, folks.
Start to follow the ditch, because temptation is so hard.
Edmundo, I think you're muted if you're trying to speak.
And those are the best words that I've ever spoken. Thank you. Thank you. So welcome back, everybody. Sorry about that. We're going to move on now to the third question. Thank you, Kimberly, for reminding me. And this, I wanted to name that this question, the third question, is probably one of the most difficult questions for all of our communities of color to speak to. And so this is the question of how do, racist attitudes, beliefs, and behavior toward other communities of color, show up in our own communities? And how does seeing this, impact our bodies, our heart, and our spirit? So this is the being self-reflective and being authentic, in alignment with that principle that we have to acknowledge something before we can move to address it and to repair it. And Chesa, I think you were gonna take the lead on this one.
Sure, I can start us off. Just because one is a person of color doesn't automatically mean they're not going to hold racist attitudes and beliefs. And concretely, some of the ways I've seen this happen just within my community is, I remember growing up, I had family members who would often make disparaging comments whenever someone in our family was in a relationship with a Black or brown person, and I think it's really important to name that these sort of racist attitudes, like we've talked about the colorism as part of our internalized racism, and that spreads to the other communities of color that we interact with, right? Because if we're looking at it from a systemic perspective, it's about white supremacy, white dominance, like the dominance of white culture. And so even within ourselves, there's this idea that, if that person is not as close to white as they can be, then they're somehow less than, And so again, it happens when, people comment on who you're in a relationship with, or even I remember after 9/11, being on a flight and one of my family members saying ooh, oh, that person looks Muslim or Middle Eastern, I'm scared to get on this plane. It's things like that, that just really seep into, our everyday life. And it's, in a large part because of the ways things are skewed in the media. But again, it's the white supremacist culture. And the way that affects my body and my heart and my spirit is just that it's exhausting, and honestly, I have not lived in the same state as my family since I was 11 years old, because I've been to boarding school and all this stuff, and then went immediately to the West Coast for college. So just a brief period of actually living near my family. And for me, it was a way to figure out things on my own, but also I'm learning this now, it's a way of not dealing with some of the lessons that I had issues with growing up, not addressing them because I was I did not feel, it's really hard, within, at least within my culture, my family, you respect your elders, you give everything to your family. There's an expression in Tagalog called utang na loob, right? Which is this internal sense of debt that you have to your family for giving you a good life, right? You know, my parents are immigrants and they have given me a really great life. I grew up with, you know, a lot of privilege in different ways. And so you're not supposed to question them. You know, you're supposed to be grateful and you're supposed to take care of them when they get old. And so it's really difficult. Like I feel my own kind of internal conflict where I go out in the world and I try to interrogate structural racism and structural inequality and all those intersections. And the work really does start at home. So I'm very fortunate that, you know, under the previous president of the United States, we were actually able to have these conversations with my family. My family got politicized in a lot of ways. And so they're starting to ask these questions and are starting to be open to these conversations. But I think it really, it's a struggle when, you know, not just, you know, with our students, but with our family members, people in our community to say, do you know where you got this belief about Black and brown folks? And do you know why you can't say stuff like that? And do you know why it's harmful? And do you know why, you know, it seems like we're all competing with each other and pitted against each other as racial groups, but we're really not, right? If we could work together to interrogate the structural aspect of racism, like we wouldn't have to be fighting with each other.
Yeah, Chesa, and, you know, and I'm going to go to Kimberly next. But one of the things that strikes me about this, you know, as a parent, because, and the impact that parents have on children, there is this very pragmatic desire for a parent to have their children survive, one, and to thrive, to have a good life. And so I can understand, I mean, this is kind of a principle from nonviolent communication of like connecting with where the person's actions are coming from, having that understanding so that I can better speak, you know, to that person. And I'm just wondering how much this plays in. It's like when parents, under oppressive conditions, under dangerous conditions, it's like you want your child to survive and to have the best possible life. And so I'm going to try to guide them in a way that is going to increase the chances that they will not suffer. And unfortunately, within a racist, structurally racist, systemically racist society, that can be the motivation for, I mean, I hear this across the board from all communities, even my Black family members, of like, you know, wanting to marry up or wanting to put themselves in a position where they're not likely to suffer. So,
and I want to qualify real quick because I don't want it to sound like my family is like a bunch of like, you know, problematic racist folks. I mean, it's not necessarily like that, but it's like my, so my father, may he rest in peace, voted for Trump. And that was a really, really difficult part of my life because he was also dying of cancer. So for me, it's like, how do we hold love in our hearts for people who do problematic things, you know? And voting for Trump is more than problematic, but how do we continue to see their humanity when they have made decisions that are so harmful, right? But to still love them because they're family.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that is such a core central question that I'm really hoping that this what your name there, Chesa, is a predominant theme when we come together at the 5th of the series sessions in terms of building our multiracial coalition solidarity for moving forward. And how do we move forward in an effective way that holds all of that complexity together? Thank you for that. Kimberly.
Thank you, Chesa, for sharing that with us. If I could add to this question, I think that for me, it's always been really important to acknowledge that in this racial hierarchy, in this society where white supremacy dominates, we not only, all by POC, of course, are oppressed under the white supremacist system, but we are also, if you are non-Black, beneficiaries to anti-Blackness within our institutions, within our structures. And so for me, it's always been so complicated and difficult to handle conversations about race within my family as well. I think for a lot of Vietnamese Americans, especially first generation Vietnamese Americans, they all receive their media from the same place. And it's these couple YouTube channels that are extremely far right, very problematic, super racist, and it's so difficult to have those conversations because it's like not only is there a language barrier, but how am I supposed to educate my aunt who has never gone past a middle school level education about the complexities of a racial hierarchy in Vietnamese? It's incredibly difficult, right? And so you have to break down those conversations very slowly and sort of unpack this idea also, and talk about multiracial coalition building, right? The fact that we as Asian Americans have rights is only because of the civil rights movement and the third world liberation movement that was championed by Black leaders, right? And so like bringing that information to my family and trying to have those conversations, well, it's like we also have that power dynamic, and our cultural differences and our language barriers is incredibly difficult. And yeah, it breaks my heart that I'm not able to reach past my family, and it's incredibly emotionally draining. But it's such necessary work, right? And I think that as Asian Americans, we as a community need to work together to not only fight against white supremacy, but also to fight against anti-Blackness within our communities. And that goes for all communities of colors too, right? Any racist beliefs against the Latinx community, any racist beliefs against Native Americans or anyone else needs to stop. And we need to have those difficult conversations. And sometimes like it's taken me years to speak to some family members, right? Because if you're too aggressive, they shut you down. They never have a conversation with you ever again. So how are you supposed to come from a place of like, I don't want to be classist, and I want to speak to you and give you love and respect, but I also cannot accept this racist behavior, and we need to talk about it. So I guess my answer to that question is it really impacts me in many ways. It hurts my heart to think that there is so much compassion coming from my family, but also a lot of racism and discrimination, right? And there needs to be active work to fight that.
Thank you, Kimberly. Absolutely. I mean, I think this is part of, again, just bringing the ethnic studies lens into it, and critical thinking lens, that it is complex and it is nuanced. It is not either or, black or white. That's not the way things work. And so in navigating the actual relationships within a fundamentally oppressive context, like it's complex, and I just appreciate you naming all of the different nuances of that. So taking a breath here as we will now shift to the fourth question. And I'm going to ask Tom if you could take the lead on this one. And like, what is the impact of racist attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors from other communities of color, on you and your community? And again, how does this impact body, heart, spirit at the worst times and in everyday life?
Well, let me try to explain something that I've been thinking a lot about, but it's a little bit particular to the kind of political work I'm doing, and then hopefully other people can add in. If I hear things from other people of color that I think are racist or disrespectful of me as Asian or Japanese American, it makes me feel invisible. It makes me feel like I'm definitely not an equal on any level. And the main thing, though, in this political work I'm involved in, when I hear this from other people of color, it makes me feel like I'm being double gaslit, if that makes sense. So I'm used to white people saying things that are insensitive or racist or hearing about it. And then if people of color say that, saying similar to that, then like, what am I supposed to do? Am I just in the middle of things, or either I'm crazy and I don't really know what's happening, or it's just emotional feeling. I'm not saying it's a rational one that's thought out. Right. And so this is a difficult thing. I've heard people, and this is more in the political movement. That's why it may not apply to a lot of other people, but I've heard stories of people of color saying Asians are adjacent to whiteness, adjacent to imperialism. And I've actually even heard this in Asian American political groups saying that Japanese Americans are adjacent to Japanese imperialism. And then I'll just give you an example to try to explain that. So then I think of my parents, my mom's family, when they were in the internment camp, concentration camp, they had to do this loyalty oath, which was bogus. I mean, they knew it was just all fake, but one of them was, do you forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? And so a lot of, like my parents, they said, generation, what the hell are they talking about? I don't have anything to do with this, so they just had to figure out how to answer it if they didn't want to get sent to another different camp. So it's like that. Like, so what are you saying, that I somehow support Japanese imperialism? So I understand the politics they're talking about in Japan, and it's imperialist, and understanding it is, and but I'm just struggling with that. But it just adds to this feeling of, well, I guess Asians are just second class. What I mean by that, either your choice is either to totally embrace the model minority concept and just stick to a certain role in this hierarchy of racism that Kimberly was talking about, and not fight for equality for everybody because you can't, because nobody likes you, everybody hates you, or what? So that's kind of the frustration I have. I mean, I have strong feelings about what to do, and basically they're just, helping people understand the history. And that's, again, I mean, all I can say is ethnic studies, because like if you actually learn the history, for example, with the anti-Asian violence that's happening right now, it's not a new thing. It's been happening ever since Asians have been here. And it's not like there's this whole time period where nothing's happened. I mean, just go do a little bit of research. There's all of these mass shootings and murders that have taken place, but nobody talks about them. And so the point isn't I'm saying that Asians are more oppressed than anybody. That's just not the point. It's just that, well, if you understand it's systemic, you understand that white supremacy is everything, including white people we're fighting against, then you can put it in some context here, that don't blame us, I mean, as Asians, it's all our fault. I mean, we have our own problems within each of our own communities, of course, but hey, we want to be in this fight. That's what I'm trying to say from my point of view. We want to be in this fight, and we want to take a stand as equals with you, and we'll do anything we can to win, and so I guess that's all. And it's kind of hard for me to explain this because this is more kind of like a rant than anything. And others, so the people on the panel can fill in for me to kind of fill it in a little more so other people can understand what I'm trying to say, maybe. Thank you.
Not at all, Tom. There's so many points that you made there that I think are super important, and I especially appreciate you calling that out, that we together need to work against white supremacy. That is a structure, that is an ideology and a way of thinking, and a structural institution that have been put into place that affect all of us, and that this is the work. I'm hearing you call that out loud and clear, that is what you're about, wanting to do this work together to transform that. But anybody else would like to speak to this question before we go? And roughly we have about 5 minutes total for this segment, and we have a couple of other questions. So if there's nobody else is burning to attend to this, add to this question, I want to move us to the next one. Okay, cool.
Oh yeah, I just want to say, like, I think there's a saying of what the oppressor wins when the oppressed wears the lens of the oppressor. And my experience growing up with just police officers, I noticed that people of color that were police officers were worse than the actual white police officers. And that was just the most, I think that was very painful to experience, to be mistreated and dehumanized by other communities that I felt would understand the struggle and plight as well.
Yeah, no, and unfortunately, policing there is a spotlight on policing now, and I am grateful that there is a shift to looking at what are the systems and structures that are in place that create the culture within policing that allows for this kind of abuse of power to occur. Because individuals go in, many individuals, not all, but I would say many individuals go in wanting to protect and to serve, and then systematically, little by little, get influenced by the structures that are in place. I mean, I was always struck by that recent video of I forget which march it was, where there was an tall elderly white male who was out there protesting, and there's one police officer just shoves them and he falls backwards and hits his head, and instinctively a police officer wants to step forward to help him, and then just as reactively another officer pushes them back and says no, this is. So I think that there is an inherent human desire to want to support each other, but then we are impacted by these cultures and ways of thinking that are in turn shaped by the structures that and the policies, the practices that are part of that. So
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I couldn't agree more on that. On how I think people of color communities, I think especially the Black community, kind of just adopt this idea that we are white adjacent, but during the '60s, that was like an initiative of the FBI and the counterintelligence program, was to try to find ways to divide us and put us against each other and show like, hey, why can't you be more like the Asian community? They're as much as in poverty as well, but they don't say anything. But there's a reason why we don't. Culturally, we don't. And I think that kind of belief kind of just like continues to carry on. And so why I think other communities of color are thinking we're white adjacent.
I know. Thank you. So now, Marlo, do you actually want to pick up on this fifth question? Because this is the one where, again, I come a lot of this from a nonviolent communication lens, and an essential part of nonviolent communication is not only describing what the experience is that is impacting you, how it feels, what it is, what need it is not being met by that impact, but it is also naming specifically what is it that we want back. And so this question is with as much specificity as possible, and this is an evolving thing for us. What is it that you long to see from other communities to stand in solidarity with you in transforming systemic racism? And how would it impact your body, heart, and spirit, to have people respond in the way that you're longing to see them respond?
Yeah, I would really love to see ethnic studies in high schools. I would love to see ethnic studies being taught that early, and I think it would create so much more of an understanding and of a connection and an appreciation of what Asian Americans bring to American influence and American culture. I saw this funny meme. It was just like, I'm probably, going on a tangent, but I love this idea of just like, how about we do a day where if you don't try Asian food, if you don't respect Asian people or something. So I want to see relationship-based schools. What would that look like to create the curriculum and having more restorative practices as opposed to expulsion and disciplinary actions. I would love to see more support for Asian American artists, Asian American storytellers. Shout out to those who watch Warrior or Kim Convenience Store. Those are the kind of things I think would really, that brings me right there, Jessa. That brings me to light is just, authentic, broad narratives of us, right? And our Asian American experience. I would love to see more Asian American administrators, professors, teachers, and especially in demographics in areas where it reflects the majority of where there's a large Asian American population. I'd love to see the case for the disaggregation of data of Asian Americans, and that's something that I was pushing for when I was working with the Center of the Research Institute, convincing other community colleges across the country to disaggregate the data so we can see the resources that can go to specific communities based upon their migration wave. Or yeah, did someone say something? I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I was having internet issues and I was worried that I was going to drop.
Okay.
Anybody else? I want to just do a quick pass here. Chessa.
I can, just in the spirit of ethnic studies and the sort of tagline, no history, no self. Just learn our history. If you don't know much about the community, learn the multiple histories, because again, we're not monolithic, and there's a lot of history of interracial solidarity and community building and advocacy work that we've done together. So I that as an educator, I'm always like, just like more education, and again, like, having ethnic studies in high school would be amazing. But also, in terms of, there is this one model of like, let's have more folks in these positions, but it's also about how do the folks in the leadership positions know the history, the complicated and layered stories of the communities, right? So that it's not just folks within the groups doing the work of educating, but so that everybody knows what the different communities are going through or have gone through throughout history. I think that would be really, really meaningful.
Cool. So at this point, I'm actually going to ask the panelists to remain here, and going to ask Dawn to put our audience into triads. So you and the audience have a chance now to respond to 3 questions yourselves. That even though it's been somewhat limited amount of time that we've had here to work together to hear, and would love it to have more time to do this. There are 3 questions that we're going to ask you to speak to in the triad that you will be in, and I'm going to pop them into the chat. What did you learn that was new or different from your previous understanding from just this time that we've had together so far? And then especially what resonated or connected with you in a very personal, real way. And then what things come to mind? What actions are you moved to take in response to what you've learned and connected with today? Okay, so we're going to ask the panelists to remain here. Going to we will essentially have only about 3 minutes per person to speak in the triads. And you might want to do it in rounds, at each person answering each of those questions first, and then come back and each person answers the second question. That would be my recommendation. But Dawn, if you could put the audience into triads, that would be great.
All right, everybody, breakout rooms are now open. The notice should be up on your screen. If you miss it, just click the breakout rooms button and it will reappear.
I know I'm receiving an invitation that I am not going to accept, so I can stay here in this room, and hopefully somebody else can get placed into room 12.
All right, someone has been moved into room 12.
Yeah. Other panelists, did you also receive?
Oh yeah, I got an.
Great. Okay, thank you folks for taking the time to check in with each other. We always realize that there's super limited amount of time and we're just barely getting going, but we wanted to at least have a little bit of a chance for you to engage and to share your voice. I'm going to ask you now, all of you, for any of you that had your thoughts and reflections, if you could actually write them into the chat, your response to those 3 questions, or whatever it is that feels most alive for you, please go ahead and put it into the chat. We'd love to keep a record of that for you. And I just want to go through, ask our panelists now to kind of give their closing thoughts, and we're combining their closing thoughts, takeaways, and appreciations for this space together. And so as we began, I wanted to start off with Chesa.
Sure. Thank you so much, Edmundo, and thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to all the attendees for being here and hearing our stories. I guess, in the sense of, I've been talking a lot about decolonization, and for me, the sort of where that arc bends towards is self-determination, right? And how do we find space and capacity to control our lives, to tell our stories, and to be to exist in our full humanity. And that is the idea, the goal that I want to leave with everybody, is like that idea of self-determination. Like, how can we break free from these structures of oppression in order to live a life that is meaningful and is aligned with our values? And I guess my invitation is, like, for us to build that vision, that reality, is like for us to see each other in our full humanity. And that means, like, if well, I say run into me, but if you run into me on Zoom, right? Or if we happen to be in a breakout room together or anything, any way that we're connecting in the future, like let's meet each other in our full humanity. And if I don't know your story, I'd love to hear it. And likewise, I hope that you'll see that about me as well, that we are not this monolithic Asian American identity, but each of us is this complicated, full, rich individual human being. And I want to see that in you as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Chessa. I'm going to go to Marlo.
I want to say thank you to everybody for spending your time here with us this Friday. You being here, listening to our stories is already an act of solidarity. And we all live in our respective communities. We have our own neighborhoods. We have our own families and extended families. So for us to continue to give each other energy and optimism and to be beacon of lights and people of agents of change to where we live and to our own family units, that is the solidarity work that we're building here together. And I also want to give a shout out to Marissa, Adriana, Alicia, Tony, Santa Ana, Stephen, and Eman for allowing us to tell the stories of our inclusion series, Candid. We have other series of communities that we're telling in the next academic year, Chicana, Latinx, LGBTQ+, stories and narratives that Native Americans and Indigenous that we will love to continue to share. And so thank you to my colleagues, and thank you for being here.
Right on. Thank you, Marlo. And Kimberly.
Yeah, I think Chessa and Marlo said many really great things that I agree with. I want to thank you all for holding us in this space, for letting us be vulnerable and to share our truth. I want to acknowledge that a lot of experiences from other intersectional backgrounds were not shared here today, from the LGBTQ+ community, from the non-binary and trans community, etc. And so I want to encourage you all to continue to search for these stories. And the conversation definitely doesn't end here. We all have to do so much work to fight for racial justice. And I'm just so thankful to be held in this space with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you so much for naming that. That is true for all of our communities, that there are all these other intersectional dimensions, that we don't have enough capacity right now to represent, but appreciate you calling that out. And now, Tom, you could close us out.
Yes, thank you. Chessa started by talking about the beginnings of ethnic studies and how it was an act of solidarity with the Third World Strike. So I wanted to end with that because to me, that's one of the most important things here. It's very difficult to talk about all these different things and to get our feelings out and in the conflicts that we have, even within people of color communities and between ourselves. But the stories of solidarity are really important to help us keep going. For me, some of the greatest inspirations in my life have been that I've had the honor to work with Black, African-American community organizations and people, Latinx community people, Indigenous people. They have made it clear to me that I can be an equal with them to really change this society. And it has helped me keep going, and I keep learning so much. So I'm hoping that we can keep this going in the campus at De Anza College, that we can talk about these stories of solidarity. There's just so many of them. I wish I could share them with you, but we don't have time. And so hopefully that'll be part of our series too. Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here. This is a wonderful experience.
Tom, every time you speak, I get choked up. I really just so much appreciate you naming that. That the spirit we want to hold on to, we want to build, we want to grow that spirit of solidarity and standing shoulder to shoulder together in common cause to reclaim the humanity for all of us here. So I'm going to invite folks to please do a waterfall, anything that you appreciated about this time we had here together, put it into the chat. Next week, a week from today, we will have the Chicanx Latinx studies community sharing experiences. At that point, the following week will be our Native American and Indigenous studies folks, and then culminating with the fifth comparative ethnic studies, where we will be talking about how all of this can come together and what are the changes that we can make structurally, systemically, starting here on our own campuses. What do we do differently to, and one of the things I want to name, because it was a thematic here, is to break down the segregation, because it is that divide and conquer principle is what is an operation. When we don't spend time with each other, we don't know each other. When we don't know each other, it's easy to fall into the stereotypes of the domination culture. So thank you all. Look forward to seeing you next week. Nos vemos. Mucho corazón. Thank you for all. Gratitude to everybody. Hasta pronto.
Some say the blacker the better, the sweeter the juice. I say the darker the flesh and the deeper the roots. I get
Want to name that if anybody it has.
Oh my gosh, love it that you're playing Tupac song.
If you have a disposition, if you can tolerate, Game of Thrones level of sex and violence, encourage people to check out the Warrior series on HBO. It's done from, I just love that it's done from a Chinese perspective, historical perspective. It's historical fiction, but very, very powerful. I loved it because it's actually because it's my idol Bruce Lee. It's built on his legacy and his work. So.
Marlo, I think this one's for you. This song's for you. Right.
And since we're listening to Tupac, I need to give a shout out to hip hop and Black culture for helping me see the world in the way that I do through that art form. And I recognize that I benefit from it teaching in the hip hop cohort. And so major love to all of those artists. Yeah. And another plug for Warrior. Yeah.
And I want to second that too. Since there wasn't any Asian American studies in high school, learning about the struggle of Black people and African Americans was like the stepping stone for me to want to learn about my history. And so, reading about Frederick Douglass, reading Malcolm X's autobiography, that all inspired me to want to learn about my roots and my people. And so, again, another appreciation to the Black community.
Big love for being trailblazers in so many ways.
Great job, everyone. Love y'all.
Gracias, Adriana.
Happy Friday. Peace and love, everyone.
Thank you,
Mother's
Tree.
Day, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, panelists are going to stay here and do a huddle.
That was so good.